Good morning and welcome our graduate students in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. You're all very wise to be here because we consider this to be a great treat to have Professor René Lemarchand, who is giving our annual lecture this afternoon, but he was so kind as to make time to come and speak with you this morning and in a more informal setting. So I will not take too much time for the introduction. I have a more formal introduction this afternoon. He is a leading specialist on Africa, especially Burundi, Rwanda, Democratic Republic of Congo. You cannot see it from his appearance, but he has been coming there for 50 years. I know that's hard to believe. And it is a wonderful honor for us to have him here today. So I'm going to pass the floor on to you for this meet and greet with our students and faculty of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Amsterdam.
Well, thank you, Nancy. It's very nice to be here. Amsterdam is one of my favorite cities in Europe. It's also a great honor, and I'm delighted to have a chance to talk to you this morning about your work, about a topic which is obviously of enormous importance. And I've been traveling quite a bit for the last few years, and I'm really quite delighted and impressed by the amount of interest that I found about genocidal phenomena in Belgium, in Holland, in Scandinavia, as against, say, France or Italy or Spain, where I don't know why there's a kind of cleavage in terms of how much interest there is in this sort of thing. Anyway, I know that you are all budding experts on the theme of genocide, and I was talking to Nancy a while ago, and I suggested to her that perhaps I should talk to you informally about the problems I have in grappling with the concept of genocide and how to really come to terms with the analytic stuff under the rubric of genocide. And so I'm going to just talk to you very informally, sort of off the cuff, about the sort of things that I'm still thinking about, and about which I have no real definitive answer. The first, of course, is what do we mean by genocide? Or the crime without a name, as Churchill called it. And of course, our first instinct is to turn to the UN Convention on Genocide of 1948, which identifies at least three major criteria. The destruction in part or in whole of a specific racial, religious, ethnic community. Doesn't mention political community. So it has to be targeted, right? It has to involve a substantial number of people. And then, and most importantly, and in a sense problematic, it has to be intentional. So we're not talking about an accidental massacre, something that just happens. It is something that is consciously and deliberately planned. Well, there are problems. First of all, why leave out political communities? Well, as you probably realize, this is something that the Russians were very much intent on putting into the declaration. The convention, because they realized, of course, that it would be all too easy for them to be pinned, to be accused of genocide, because they're denying, or they are moving against, repressing, if you will, the demands for political rights on the part of particular communities, seeking autonomy, like in the Caucasus in particular, or Far East. And that, of course, has remained a major problem, because I can think of, not too many cases where the political dimension is to be excluded. Certainly in the case of Rwanda, I mean, the political dimension is absolutely crucial. Now, another thing which bothers me is in whole or in part, what does that mean? I mean, in part could be 10% of the population, or 2%. So have we reached, is there anything like a threshold beyond which, you know, a massacre becomes genocide? And there isn't any such quantifiable threshold. But it is, I think, you know, whenever I ask my student, what is genocide? And they'd say, well, that's when a lot of people get killed. Yeah, that's one aspect, of course, but it's not because a lot of people get killed that the result is a genocide. So how many people have to be killed before you can call it genocide? This is still a very problematic issue. Excuse me. Well, what about the intentionality of genocide? That's, I think, is very problematic because you don't know when the killings are the result of a long, well mapped out, planned murder, or whether it is in a kind a measure of self-protection. You kill the other because if you don't kill him or her, it will be you. So, and I think we have pretty much this dimension in Rwanda. I mean, when the Tutsi warriors of Mr. Kagame, well, that's before Kagame arrived on the scene, invaded the country on October the 1st, 1990. This triggered a civil war, which reached the point where, you know, it was really either you or me. And I think that this is one dimension that you find in a lot of other contexts. Certainly doesn't obtain the case of the Holocaust, at least not to my understanding. Maybe you can educate me on that. But how to define intentionality is another problem that I find very difficult to deal with. So, as I said, I mean, I don't have the answers to these issues. I'm just thinking about what is a genocide. And of course, the reason why there's so much delay in implementing any kind of action to prevent genocide is that sometimes people can't agree as to whether we're dealing with genocide or something else. And that's the reason why people like David Sheffer, who was a high-ranking official in the U.S. State Department, said a couple of years ago, we have to do away with the term genocide. We should talk about atrocity crimes, which is a much more all-encompassing formula, but one about which there's perhaps less disagreement. And so maybe that if we talk about atrocity crimes rather than genocide, since nobody seems to agree, maybe we can think more seriously about intervention in the form, say, of R2P, responsibility to protect, which more later. Now, having said that, there's another problem that I've been trying to grapple with, and that is what different kinds of genocide can we discern? I mean, not all genocides are alike. They come about in response to very different sets of circumstances. And here I lean very heavily on the insights of Helen Fine, who's written knowledgeably and seminally about genocide. She's a sociologist who I think she's been teaching at Columbia for a number of years. But I find her writings extraordinarily stimulating. She talks about three different kinds of genocide. You have the ideological type genocide. There's the developmental, what some would call colonial genocide. And then there's the retributive type genocide. And I would like to spend a little bit of time with you sort of discussing these three forms of genocide. And then I will end up and then turn over to you for questions and comments. Spend a little bit of time on preventing strategies. Well, let me start with the developmental genocide. This is probably one of the most widespread historically, and namely the extermination of entire indigenous populations in the name of progress and development. I'm coming from the United States. I'm fully aware of the way in which native populations have been exterminated for the sake of perhaps a manifest destiny or development. Sometimes the purpose remains unstated, but anyway, there's no doubt that a large number of native Indians were exterminated to make room for the incoming waves of settlers, of white settlers, particularly in California. And as one who has lived in Florida for a number of years, I'm also aware of the Cherokees that were massively pulled out of their native turf to make room for the incoming settlers. So that's one type of genocide which has been going on for a long time, historically. Another type is the most obvious to all of us here, and that is the ideological genocide. People being killed in the name of an ideology. And that is, of course, at the very center of the Holocaust. The identification of Jews as a threat to humanity, as a breed of people who were not to be trusted and who, if left unchecked, would bring about disasters on the Aryan race. Now, this is part of a mythology that enters, of course, very prominently into Nazi ideology. I don't even need to elaborate on that. But except perhaps to say that there's been a tendency on the part of outside observers to designate the Rwandan genocide as an ideological genocide, accomplished in the name of the Hamitic hypothesis. The early missionaries to Rwanda were really hung up on the Hamitic hypothesis. Not only the Belgian or German missionaries, but social scientists like Seligman, for instance, who talks about the arrival to Rwanda of people from Asia, from somewhere outside Rwanda. They were very astute. They were unusually bright. They belonged to a higher civilization, the Hamites, les Hamites, le mythe Hamite, as the French would call it. So the theory here is that the genocide was committed against the Tutsi because the Tutsi were described as members of the Hamitic race who just don't belong here. And if that's the case, you have to take them out or kill them. The famous phrase by Leon Mugesera, why don't you go back to where you come from, to Abyssinia? So certainly there's, I think, a carryover of this Hamitic myth. But I wouldn't really give it as high a prominence as some, like Jean-Pierre Chrétien, for instance, my colleague in Paris, with whom I disagree on just about everything, who's talked about the Hamitic myth at some length. I'm not denying, that this is a mythical representation of the Rwandan population that has gained currency, certainly among Europeans, among administrators and missionaries. But I just don't know. I mean, the Hutu genocide, were they really motivated by the Hamitic ideology? I don't think so. They were killing Tutsi because it was either them or us. It was a much more, shall we say, categorical definition of the problem, of the issue. Anyway, so ideology is, I think, another criteria to explain why people kill each other. And then there's a third type, which is retributive genocide. This is a formula coined by Helen Fine, which means that genocide takes place in response to a threat, either perceived or real. Now, it goes without saying that these are not mutually exclusive categories. Certainly the Jews in Nazi Germany were not only perceived in ideological terms as an Untermenschen, but it's also important to remember that they were seen as posing a threat to the Aryan community, which is nonsense, of course. But this was this was part of the myth, part of the explanation for exterminating these people. Well, in the case of Rwanda, I think, and the case of Burundi, because it's not only in Rwanda but also in Burundi that you've had a genocide. In Rwanda, you had a genocide of Tutsi in 1994, but causing the deaths of over 600,000 innocent civilians. But in Burundi in 1972, you also had a genocide that nobody seems to remember, even though I do, because I remember quite vividly in 1972 when it took place. I lost some very, very close friends during this mass killing, causing the death of anywhere from 200,000 to 300 Hutu, in response to a local insurgency. I mean, there was certainly an element of retribution to the genocide of Hutu. The Hutu insurgency took place in April of 1972 in a place called Rumonge. This is a lovely lakeside community about 50 miles south of Bujumbura. And this resulted in the death of about, nobody knows really how many Tutsi were killed. Some claim 5,000 Tutsi civilians. I think this is probably an overestimation. I mean, here it could be a few hundred or a few thousand, but not really. We're not talking about tens of thousands. Well, as might have been expected, the Tutsi-dominated army of the Micombero was the name of the president of Burundi at the time, intervened and did what any other national army would have done, that is, engage in a repression. But after having repressed those that were seen as the killers, then the army went on a genocidal spree. And this is also what you had in eastern Congo in 1996. Now, if you talk to Rwandan officials about the killings of Hutu in eastern Congo, they'll tell you, these were the génocidaires. I mean, you know, we had to deal with these guys because otherwise they would have tried to re-enter Rwanda, and there was a real security threat to our country. And I think this is undeniable. If I had been in Kagame's shoes, I would have done exactly the same. I would have tried to destroy the camps, or above all, destroy the génocidaires from the camp. Because you have to remember, you had in the camps a whole lot of civilians who had nothing to do with the killings. So after destroying the camps, then you had what I would describe as a genocide. Stephen Smith, who was at the time a journalist for Libération and Le Monde, and who looked very seriously at the evidence, claims that about 200,000 Hutu civilians were killed in 1997 late 96, 97 by the Rwandan army. And I think that this is basically correct. And what happened then after the destruction of the camps in eastern Congo, you had about 20 of those strung along the border, was very much in the nature of a genocide. And this is substantiated actually by the so-called mapping report of the United Nations that came out in late 2010. And reading this report, I mean, it will make your hair stand. This is absolute. I mean, it's a litany of killings in one place after another, again and again and again. It's nauseating. I've written about this in a chapter for a book that's supposed to come out anytime soon, but I'm not sure it will. Let's go back then to what Helen Fine calls retributive genocide. And it is in Rwanda that the notion of retribution is most obvious, I think, because as I've said and will say again this afternoon, there would have been no genocide had it not been for the fact that the refugee warriors came in from Uganda, massively, about 4,000, 5,000, and entered the country massively supported by Uganda. And this is what triggered a civil war. And the civil war explains, of course, the horrors that have accompanied the military engagements taking place between 4 years. Remember, I mean, they entered the country on October the 1st, 1990, and it's only 4 years later. Something few people are aware of, you know, that for a long time you had a civil war raging throughout the country. And this is very nicely brought out by Scott Strauss in his book on the order of genocide, and he shows how the killings of Tutsi cannot be understood otherwise than in the context of this extremely bitter civil war. And as in all civil wars, atrocities were committed by both sides. That atrocities were committed by Tutsi is not something that is openly recognized by Mr. Kagame, of course. What you have in Rwanda today is a good guys versus bad guys story. You know, all the Tutsi were good guys, and the bad guys were Hutu. Well, because this is sheer nonsense. So this is what I mean by retributive genocide. Massive killings happen because of a perceived threat. It's not only in Rwanda that you've had this sort of thing. You've had this in former Yugoslavia. You've had this, of course, in Cambodia as well, and many other. Certainly not in the case of the Holocaust, except, you know, as a myth, of course. So these, as I said, these are not mutually exclusive labels. You have to realize that sometimes, in most instances, what you have are mixed types. Genocides which are in part ideological, in part retributive. And unless you bear that in mind, I think you're going to have a very difficult time trying to come to grips with the realities on the ground, so to speak. Well, let me perhaps say a few words about, do you have time for a few words about prevention? Or
Yes.
5 minutes, maybe?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Well, it is only recently that genocide as a scourge has been taken seriously by social scientists and decision makers. And there are a number of formulas floating around which aim at bringing genocide under control to an end, preventing genocide. And I think there are three ways of handling this. First of all, you have normative formulas, like R2P, a formula invented by Gareth Evans, who was once Prime Minister of Australia, who worked very hard on this responsibility to protect R2P formula. And it was adopted at the summit meeting of the UN General Assembly back, I think it was in 2011, if I'm not mistaken, but I may be wrong. And it was universally accepted by virtually all members of the United Nations. And what this means, responsibility to protect, is that states have the responsibility to take appropriate measures to prevent people from being exterminated en masse. In other words, it's a way of overcoming the obstacle of national sovereignty. National sovereignty has consistently been invoked to prevent intervention from the outside. Well, Gareth Evans, who is someone for whom I have enormous respect, and that I think has rendered enormous, who's been instrumental in trying to prevent, but not very, not to the extent. You know, the case of Libya would be a good example of how R2P really worked well in practice. Syria is, of course, the opposite example, demonstrate that it doesn't really work. So whether you either want to concentrate on Libya or Syria to demonstrate the truth of the falsity of his claims. Anyway, and then there's W2I, the will to intervene. This is another sort of short-handed formula which has been hammered out by Frank Chalk and René Lemarchand. I don't need to tell you who René Lemarchand was. He was the man in charge of the International Intervention Force in Rwanda during the genocide. Poor man didn't really did a very good job of preventing the killings. But this will to intervene says that it is in the interest of the national interest of nations to intervene. If you don't intervene, eventually things will get out of hand, and this will threaten your national interest. So these are normative ways of developing ways of preventing genocide. Now, in addition to that, you have institutional mechanisms, like, for example, the United Nations Office of the Security of the Secretary General to prevent genocide, or for genocide prevention. I'm sorry. An office which was held, if my memory serves me right, by a Sudanese by the name of Deng, and who didn't do a very good job of preventing genocide, certainly in the Sudan. Again, the case of the Sudan is another bone of contention among scholars. Some saying there was no genocide in Darfur, others, like Eric Reeves, saying quite to the contrary, it was a genocide. And the controversy is typical.
We just heard that recently at our Darfur event from the ambassador himself.
Mm. So this is one institutional mechanism among others. And there's a third kind of mechanism that needs to be mentioned, and this is what David Schaffer has tried to accomplish. He's tried to reconceptualize genocide. He's saying that the best way to prevent genocide is to stop talking about genocide. Well, let's talk about what? Well, let's talk about atrocity crimes. And this does mean that we have to do away with genocide altogether, but we have to incorporate it in a broader rubric. which he calls atrocity crimes. I'm trying to remember what his function, I mean, I'm talking about David Sheffer. I think he was a member of the Clinton government in charge of human rights, if I remember correctly. You should know about that, Thijs.
Yeah, he was ambassador at large for war crimes.
That's right.
He was one of the main vehicles behind the creation of the International Criminal Court.
Yeah. So I listened to him a couple of times. He's a very bright man. He's written a book recently. I think it's sort of a memoir, where he also talks about, the need to introduce a new way of looking at genocide, atrocity crimes. Well, in a chapter that I wrote on prevention for the book that's coming out soon, which is, you remember at the conference that we both attended, there was quite a lot of talk about how to prevent genocide. And I made the point that whereas I'm in agreement that genocide has been a source of controversy among scholars, among decision makers, because there seems to be so little in the way of the consensus about what is really genocide. People are getting, okay, is this a genocide? No. Oh, yes, it is. Well, there's no agreement. So what do? We do nothing. And meanwhile, people are being killed. And so I agree that we need to overcome this ambiguity inherent in the concept of genocide. But the question is in my mind is, if people cannot agree about genocide, I'm not sure that they can agree on anything else, including what is atrocity crimes or what are atrocity crimes. So this is a question that I think needs to be raised. And again, I have no definitive answer to it. But anyway, I thought I would share with you my thoughts on these various issues. These are the sort of things that I've been grappling with over the last few years, bearing in mind essentially the cases of Rwanda and Burundi. But I think these are issues that can be applied across the board to a lot of cases. So the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, René, for sharing your erudition and making us think about how complex these questions are, and also the problems of definitions of victims, perpetrators, and genocide itself. This is actually perfect timing to have brought in so many problems, because it's the beginning of a new study for many of our students here, and they can recognize a lot of issues with which they'll be confronted. And it's nice for them to know that we don't have the answers yet either. So with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to all of you for questions, comments, responses.
I had a question about the use of the word atrocities, because within the definition of the word is not that it's consciously planned.
It's not that?
It is consciously planned.
Ah.
And the whole issue with genocide is that there is this ideological reason or this retribution reason, and atrocities can just be accidental.
That's
as well.
Right. Absolutely.
But why then use the word atrocities?
Well, your question is really right on target. And this is one of the reasons why I think that, I didn't mention that, but I think that you've taken words out of my mouth. Indeed, atrocity, by substituting atrocity crimes for genocide, this is not going to solve, the problem. And I think, as you said, atrocity crimes need not be planned. At least some people would. I agree with you entirely. And this is one of the weaknesses about substituting one terminology for another. So I agree with you. So, well, it may be, of course, that for Schaeffer, intentionality is no longer that important. We should intervene no matter what, whether we're dealing with intended killings on a mass scale, or whether we're dealing with with mass killings that are not necessarily planned. And from that perspective, I think that a case could be made for intervening, say, in a place like Rwanda in 1994, a posteriori, of course. But very good point.
I had a question. I've always been quite interested in the causes of genocide. And I was just wondering, this is kind of specifically about Rwanda, and to what extent do you see the sort of colonial powers as having a responsibility for what went on there? And if so, to what extent did they have a responsibility to intervene and to prevent the genocide?
That's a very good question too. I think in a fundamental sense, the colonial authorities racialized the Hutu-Tutsi divide in a way that didn't exist before. There's been this notion floating around that all Tutsi are wealthy and powerful, were wealthy and powerful, and all Hutu were really peons at the bottom of the heap. Nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, in traditional Rwanda, you had a very small minority of Tutsi, those who came out of the clan, the Banyiginya clan, which was the clan within which aspirants to power, to the waniship, to the kingship, were recruited. But you had a lot of poor Tutsi. I mean, you had a lot of Tutsi that were just as poor as any Hutu. And by the same token, you had Hutu who were fairly well off, and who were in fact wealthier than some Tutsi elements. Now the Belgians have introduced a radical transformation of society by racializing the Hutu-Tutsi divide, and that has undoubtedly contributed to bring about one of the background factors behind the genocide, namely ethnicity. It has undoubtedly, I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that the Belgians have been not only guilty of racializing the Hutu-Tutsi divide, but in addition to that, things in Rwanda remained the same until, I would say, the mid-late 50s. When the French, the Belgians said they moved their gun from one shoulder to the next. Ils ont changé leur fusil d'épaule. And then they reversed steam, so to speak, after having propelled, the Tutsi to the center stage in terms of economic and social and political power. Then they switched sides. And they turned to the Hutu manifest to the Hutu 1956, etc. And to the point where they engineered a revolution in 1956. The term that you hear about, the Hutu revolution of 1959, is the social revolution, which was not a social revolution only, it was also a political revolution. And I remember very distinctly at the time that it took place. The Belgian military resident militaire, Colonel Logiste, was called upon to help out the Tutsi to seize power. And that didn't go very well because there were a lot of Hutu who were very closely connected to their Tutsi patrons through clientage ties. And it was a sundering of ties, Hutu-Tutsi ties, which in some cases, not massively, but in a lot of cases, caused a migration not only of Tutsi, but their Hutu clients as well to neighboring states, particularly like what was known at the time as Belgian Congo, and then Zaire, and then Congo. So, your question is a very important one. Now, raises an interesting point in regard to the historiography of the genocide in Rwanda. I think that a lot of analysts tend to write history backwards in time. In other words, to see the roots of the genocide, you know, in the Hutu-Tutsi divide that was going on during much of the colonial years. I'm not convinced. Well, yeah, I mean, you know, there's certainly an ethnic dimension, undoubtedly. I mean, the victims were Tutsi and the killers were Hutu, but there were also a lot of Tutsi killers and a lot of Hutu victims. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. But, you know, if you say, well, the genocide was inscribed from the very beginning when the Belgians took over and sowed the seeds of mass murder, that I think I don't buy. I think there was no reason why Hutu and Tutsi could not have lived in relative harmony, despite this background of ethnic discrimination. I think what's missing in that, you know, writing of the history of genocide backwards, as I said, what's missing is an appreciation of the politics of genocide. There would have been no genocide if, you know, the Front Patriotique Rwandais, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, had not invaded Rwanda in 1990. Of that I'm absolutely convinced. And that's why I'm tempted to hold both Kagame and the RPF leaders responsible for the genocide, because they created the set of circumstances that led directly to the genocide. And of course there's the question of the shooting down of Habyarimana's plane in April 6, 1994. So you're raising an important question. Again, you know, there's no consensus. I mean, what I've just told you is my way of looking at things. It doesn't mean that everybody will agree with me. But
including Kagame himself.
Oh, yeah.
Particularly Kagame himself.
So I think there's a political dimension to the genocide that is very important to bear in mind, which is traceable to the invasion of 1990. I mean, even though the impact of racialization, which comes about as a result of Belgian colonial, has to be kept in the background.
So you don't think Belgium has any sort of obligation to intervene or anything like that, or had any obligation or anything?
Oh, I think the Belgians and the French should have intervened to prevent the genocide, absolutely, and not only that, but the international community. But it's not because Belgium was partially responsible for deepening the split that this creates a moral obligation to intervene. Quite aside from that, they had a moral obligation resulting from the fact that people are being killed en masse. And that's enough of a reason to intervene.
Okay.
Yes.
It's maybe a good question after the responsibility of states outside, because I was only a few days in Rwanda, and I was really surprised about the order of the society. Like everything was really well arranged, everything was clean, things like that. And I'm also aware of the really difficult or complicated, not difficult, but complicated social structure in Rwanda. And maybe also the existence of a kingdom that is already for a long time there. So I was wondering, or I had the feeling that the Rwandan people are really hierarchy sensitive, in the sense that
the Rwandan people are highly what?
Well,
hierarchy.
Hierarchical, yeah.
In the sense that they really listen to the layer above them or something. Yeah, I don't know if it is very low in English. So I was wondering if you agree with that, and if you think that that contributed to the scale of the genocide.
I'm not quite sure that I grasped the last point that you made. You're talking about the hierarchical structure of Rwandan society might have been a contributing factor.
Yeah.
Good question. First of all, I agree. I mean, you said that Rwanda is a very different place from what it used to be. Not only because, Kagame is very much concerned about cleanliness, about modernizing society, about transforming this traditional society into a modern state system. And this is undoubtedly, and the man has a touch of genius. I mean, not only in terms of strategy, but also he has performed an economic miracle with a massive donations from the international community, of course, and the theft of natural resources from the Congo. But that's another story. We don't want to get into that. But yes, you're right. Rwanda has always been hierarchical. I mean, it was the most unequal society anywhere in Africa that I can think of, and the most centralized. It was an extraordinarily centralized and society. But inequality was not between Hutu and Tutsi, it was between the power holders, the Nyiginya and the Bega also. And Kagame is himself of noble origins, as in Wega. The Bega clan and the Banyiginya clan were really the power holders. Today, Kagame has engaged in a radical restructuring of Rwanda society. There are no longer Hutus and Tutsi, as you well know. All you have are Banyarwanda. And anybody who dares challenge this redefinition of the social matrix is likely to end up in the clink. So don't talk about Tutsi, don't talk about Hutu. We are all Banyarwanda. And this stems from a misreading of the causes of genocide. For Kagame, we're going back to what this young man was telling us a while ago about, the racialization, the ethnic divide. This is a thesis to which Kagame subscribes entirely. He says that the Belgians are really responsible for the genocide because they have deepened the divide between Hutu and Tutsi. So since it's a Hutu-Tutsi problem, the solution is to do away with Hutus and Tutsis. We're going to change people's self-perceptions and make sure that they don't define themselves as Hutus or Tutsi, but only as Banyarwanda, the people of Rwanda. Well, that's nonsense, of course. I mean, you're never going to, bring about a loss of ethnic identity by the stroke of a pen. And this is exactly what Kagame is doing. He's redefined Rwandan society. So I'm going back to your question. Rwanda remains highly hierarchical. But there's no way you can say that the Hutu are, the top dogs.
No, I was not asking it in that way. I think I was more like what you're saying, that the genocide was beyond the racial aspect, and that because of the political aspect, people are more willing to listen what they were told by those who were in power and were afraid of losing it.
Yeah, in other words, they're willing to listen to those who tell them how to think.
Yes.
Because if they don't, they're going to be in trouble, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I would certainly agree with you. And one of the secrets of Kagame's overpowering presence is the fact that he controls the army and the police and the instruments of force. And the elections that are going on today in Rwanda are, in theory, multi-party elections. You have the PSD, you have the Liberal Party, you have a couple of other parties, the Green Party in particular, whose president was discovered one morning, his some time ago decapitated. That really sort of...
Is he popular, Kagame?
It's difficult to tell, but he's certainly not popular among the top elite, many of whom have deserted Rwanda, are now living in exile. Nyamwasa, for instance, who used to be the chief of staff, or for that matter, Patrick Karegeya, who was in charge of international security, and many others, and a lot of defectors. And by the way, one of the things that I've stressed again and again, because people tell me, how do you know that Kagame was responsible for shooting down the presidential plane that carried Habyarimana from Dar es Salaam to Kigali? Well, this was incidentally the triggering factor behind the killings. When you hear these high-ranking defectors saying, yes, I know he did it because I was there. Abdul Ruzibiza has written a wonderful book and frightening indictment of Kagame, Rwanda, l'histoire secrète, secret history, which hasn't been translated into English, unfortunately. Well, he says, I was in charge of the commando that brought down the plane. When you read this, it makes you, it concentrates the mind and makes you think twice about, the kind of lies that Kagame has been coming up with. But the international community doesn't say a thing about it. Why? Because, we're not going to put Kagame, at The Hague before the criminal court. We're not going to yank him out of this. It's really terrible. I'm the first one to recognize him. You pull him out, and what next? Could be anarchy. So we don't like him. Well, we have mixed feelings. Oh, well, he's made a miracle, of course. Well, sure, I wouldn't put his name on my guest list if I had a cocktail party, because he's infréquentable, as the French would say. But he's in power, and so far he's not creating too many problems, except, of course, when he sends, assistance to the M23 in the Congo. That's something that's a little bit annoying. But so we're going to, give him a rap on the knuckles, and we can say, don't do that. That's bad. And that's about the end of it, So yes, the international community has reduced its aid, but other than that, not much is happening. For better or for worse, I think it's for worse myself. So did I answer your question? Maybe not.
Yeah.
Yes, I think. Okay.
Other questions? Please.
How, you mentioned the M23. How much do you think the international community's response, or kind of lack of response to the ongoing crisis in the Eastern DRC, is coloured by their genocide guilt of not having done enough in Rwanda, and now they're very anxious for Rwanda not to become an enemy, for Rwanda not to go back to being this unstable state, and so they're almost letting that happen in Eastern Congo instead?
I think you've got a point. I think in part, yes. It's speculative, of course. We don't have really a way of finding out whether there's this awful feeling of guilt for not entering, and therefore let's be kind, he's suffered too much. They have suffered too much, and so forth. I think that's probably part of the story. I'm not sure it's the whole story, but there's also the fact that the Congolese themselves have to be blamed for not really getting their act together, for not really putting a state together, or a security force that's worth the name of a Congolese national army. What you had is a rabble. And the Congolese army, as you all realize, is guilty of crimes against humanity as much as any other faction floating around in the Congo. So let's be realistic. So there's also the fact that a lot of people, justifiably, are quite ambivalent about what is happening. Yes, the Rwandans are really interveners. They deny it vehemently, but of course we know better. So what do? Well, we could blow the whistle, or do more than blow the whistle. We could really be much, and this is where I think the international community deserves to be criticized and bears some of the blame for what's going on. We've always been, we've been treating Kagame with kid gloves. We've always been reluctant to say, enough is enough, or else. And that means turning off the faucet. That means openly blaming the intervention of Rwanda in the passing, a non-binding resolution in the United Nations, bringing in the European Union, making a big fuss about it. This we didn't do. And I think we should have made a big fuss about the consistent, we're not talking only about the last 2 or 3 years, Before M23, you had CNDP, Conseil National pour la Défense du Peuple, and Kunda. Before you had two sports